morning, I'm going to talk about innocence and blindness. I think it's kind of interesting. This hadn't occurred to me until the class this morning, but Hebrews 11 in the class we've been talking about faith allows us to see things that he keeps using the term aren't really there. They are really there, but not physically there. We can't see them with physical eyes. John 9, however, has a not contradictory, but uses different terms to teach a different idea about our approach in how we get questions answered. And that's what we're going to be going through this morning. I have divided it up into three parts. I'm not going to read the whole thing in one chunk to begin with, but we'll just start by reading the first part about a healing that occurs in John chapter 9, verses 1 through 12. As he, this is Jesus, passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "It is he." Others said, "No, but he is like him." He kept saying, "I am the man." So they said to him, "Then how are your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know." So we start off this story. Sort of the prompt to the whole thing is Jesus' disciples asking the wrong question. The reason it's the wrong question is because they've made an assumption in their question. They've assumed that they know something they've assumed something is true that they don't actually know is true, and turns out is not true. And this is the first sort of hint we have at what has gotten to a lot in this section of what we're going to be talking about, of the way we approach trying to get answers to questions that we come up with life, and we do come up with them, is their starting point is just a bad one because of this assumption that they've made. Luckily for them, not luckily, providentially for them and for us, Jesus is there to straighten it out. So, but the assumption that they make is that the man's blindness is directly due to somebody's sin. That's the assumption. So then their question is that sin his parents or his own? I think it's almost certain that this is a poor idea from poor spiritual leadership that the nation of Israel has at this time. The religious leaders of Israel were not doing a good job. We're not doing really their job at all of teaching the people what was right, what the law actually was. It was do our traditions, and you're in the in crowd, and we won't kick you out of the synagogue, and also we're in power. Seemed to be pretty much their game. But had Jesus' disciples been presented with and taught about what the prophets actually said, this is a ridiculous question to ask. You would know from the outset that this isn't it. I think it's interesting if you jump back probably just a few lines up in John chapter 8 verse 53. Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and Abraham and the prophets and who actually is Jesus and where's his power from. "Are you greater than our father Abraham who died?" So they're saying Abraham was great. And the prophets died. Okay, well, they've thrown the prophets in there with Abraham. They, in word, hold the prophets in very high esteem. But Ezekiel, flip over there to 18:20. It's not like this was yet to be written. 18:20. The soul who sins shall die. The Son shall not suffer for the iniquity of the Father, nor the Father suffer for the iniquity of the Son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. Should the disciples have known this? Yes, they should. Should the question that they asked have come up? Not that question. That question certainly is reasonable in that case, but not that question. Also, there's an obvious logical conclusion in their question that they sort of come to. They state the answer to their question, or part of their question, in their question. Did this man sin so that this man would be born blind? There's a disconnect in timing there. Before you're born, you can't really do anything but wiggle, and certainly, before you're, the age of accountability, 10 or 12, or whatever the time might be for whatever person, you cannot sin. So, did this man sin before he was capable of sinning, so that he would then be born blind after his sin? Well, that's a nonsense question to ask. And then the other part of the question about it being his parents, Ezekiel clears that up a long time ago. So they shouldn't have even been here in the first place, but with having the Pharisees to rely on for teaching, it seems that that's where they're at. However wrong, I turned away from John, now I'm not there anymore. However wrong their question was, I do still think it was a somewhat honest line of questioning. They don't have an agenda that they're trying to get to. They have a misunderstanding, and they ask Jesus a question, and he goes on to answer it. But they think they know something that they in fact don't know. They sort of follow that down a rabbit trail because it's assumed is true, and it gets them somewhere else. But they act on what they think they know. That's what we all do. The question is, what is our motivation behind that, and how verifiable is the thing that we're basing our assumption on? So then we have the response, Jesus' response to them. Obviously, he has a situation he needs to deal with. If he doesn't say anything about this, then they won't have their question answered, and they'll still be thinking that someone's sin directly caused this. No surprise, Jesus is prepared to answer the question. It's a teaching moment for the disciples. As far as we're concerned, if someone from the world comes up to us, and we are God's people, we're supposed to know His Word. If someone from the world comes up to us and asks us the wrong question, and Lee, when you're in the booth, how often does that happen? People don't know what they're talking about when it comes to spiritual things, so people ask the wrong questions. We need to be familiar enough with the truth to be able to discern that they really don't know what they're asking. This is what they're trying to get at. I may have mentioned this one time before, but one time when I was at school in New York City, I was sitting in a hallway waiting for a class, and a teacher was talking to somebody else down the hall and saying something to the student about, so are you Orthodox, something, I don't remember what it was, something about the religion, and I sort of mumbled offhandedly to the kid sitting next to me that I didn't even know it was illegal to ask people stuff like that anymore, or whatever. And so that led into him asking me that some friend of his had read just the section where it says, "I do not permit a woman to exercise authority over a man." Well, of course, that completely out of context can be taken to put women on a very low pedestal, and of course, the enlightened person takes great offense at this. So he was asking me about that, and so the explanation going on. But if someone is trying to ask a question, but they don't really know where they're going with it, we need to be prepared for that. That's all I was really trying to say with that. Jesus, of course, is. I think it's interesting, he doesn't reprimand them for the question itself. He doesn't even reprimand them for their assumption. Sort of glosses over that and the explanation, and he explains their assumption away, that that's not correct. But it's not wrong to ask why something might be. A better question, I think, would have been just, why was this man born blind? You have this person's creator standing there next to you, and you're wondering, why is this the case? Ask him just, why was he born blind? And he will give whatever answer seems best to him. The answer might be, and this is another application for us, the answer to any question might be that the works of God might be displayed. That is a valid answer to a question. So in our case, we may be asking, why is insert anything? That very well may be the answer. We are not going to have Jesus standing there next to us telling us, or in a dream or a vision or whatever, that the works of God might be displayed is why you broke your leg or why George was in the hospital for a couple days, kind of a thing. But that might be the answer. That kind of leaves us in a very dubious, well, we don't really know anything about any situation going on. But the underlying limit of the questions that we ask needs to be that we have faith that God is going to take care of our souls. Whatever's going on in the physical world doesn't really so much matter. If it comes to death, why might this be? It might be so that God can show other people that people have faith in me. That might be the case. So they have an assumption. It's not necessarily wrong to have some assumptions, but we need to check into them, and we should generally try to avoid them. Economics is full of assumptions. Maybe that's why we're always so wrong about economics. And then, so that the conversation started in the wrong direction, Jesus corrects the wrong and then moves the conversation in the right direction. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day, night is coming when no one can work. In Galatians 6:10 it says, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all men. Jesus in this case, being the perfect real-life application of what God wants, has an opportunity, and so good is done. And that should also be a reflection of what we do. The third part of this first section is Jesus sends him off to go wash, and then he comes back, and the people are all wondering, what exactly is going on here, because something strange has gone on. I kind of noticed when I was going through this, I didn't really go in a whole lot to, we spit on the ground and did this and the miracle, whatever, because through the other two sections, the inquisition of the Pharisees, and then when Jesus is talking to the man again, it's sort of a crescendo of the point to where right at the end he states it pretty clearly, where, so Jesus has done a miracle, and that's the underlying reason for the story really existing. It wasn't just some people walking down the road, although things like that do happen. But the miracle seems to be a reason for this idea to be taught, and we'll be getting into that idea because that's the point. So something absolutely new has occurred. We'll mention this again when we get to it, but in verse 32, the man says, never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. So this is not a thing that happens. Raised from the dead, okay, that's a big deal. That would impress me, but that happened back in the old days, so that's nothing new. But someone who was born blind now can see, wow, that's a new thing. So there's kind of two questions that the people need to answer. So here we're going to have another line of questioning in order to reach a conclusion. Jesus has left, and there's some disbelief in the people who were there. So it says the man came back from washing. Jesus puts the mud on his eyes, says, go to this pool and wash. He goes, he comes back, and the people who were there recognize him. So he's back in the same place that he was in before, but Jesus isn't there. So Jesus is gone. Regarding the people's disbelief, I'm pretty sure we would all be shocked, and we would say in disbelief to some extent. If something like this happened around us, they don't have all the evidence they need. The only thing they have is their introduction to something's going on. Is that looks a whole lot like a guy who's been here a long time, and he's been blind since birth, and now all of a sudden he's walking around and he can see. That's all they know. So some people say, yeah, that's definitely the guy. Other people say, no, it looks like him. And that's definitely an easier explanation than that's the guy and suddenly he can see again. But the man, it says, keeps on saying, I'm the man. So he kind of clears that up for them. Momentary application for us. When we live the way we ought to live, that's going to change the way we live, because we used to do bad things. Now we should be doing good things. We should also be quick and bold to attribute changes to God, because people ought to be able to notice that there's something different about that person. They're living a different way, and it's because God has provided purpose, provided direction. I believe in God, that sort of thing. Not just leave that up to assumption. We should be broadcasting that. So the first question, like I said, man's kind of cleared up is the is it me? Is that really the same person question? It's like, it is me. I was blind and now I can see. So if this is in fact you, how in the world can you see now? Because we've had a thing happen that can't happen. That's impossible, and yet it's been done. So what method was used to attain something that's unattainable? Because it's never happened before. Illustration for this, I have played my meager attempt at basketball with both Lee and Tony, and you know full well that I cannot dunk. I might not even be able to dunk on a little type hoop anymore. But I just can't do it. I can't even touch the net. I'm not even beginning to be close. And so if I were to come in today or next Sunday or whatever and say, hey guys, I can dunk, you'd be like, no, you can't. And no, I really can. You'd be like, okay, how? And it's been a while, but last time we played, you weren't even beginning to be close. Apparently nothing's changed. Maybe I've gotten a little bit fatter, but nothing apparently has changed so that you would now be able to do that thing that was completely out of your reach before. And if I were to say, oh, well, I've been doing 800 squats a day and now I'm really good at jumping, they'd be like, okay, maybe that seems plausible. We'll still like to see it before we believe you, but it seems like it might be reasonable. However, that's sort of a reasonable answer. The answer here is Jesus, a man, made some mud and put it on my eyes, and I went and washed, and now all of a sudden I can see. That answer doesn't provide a, why didn't we think of that? Duh! Put some mud on your eyes and wham, you can see. So that doesn't answer the question, so they need something else. Certainly at some point there have been some blind person who, I'm not trying to be funny, but tripped and fallen in the mud and gotten mud on their face. Well, that didn't heal them from being blind. So if that's how it happened, where is this guy? Because mud getting on your face and then cleaning it off doesn't cure blindness, and we know that. That's not an assumption, we know that. So the only other thing going on in here is Jesus. It must have been him. And again, this is this is an honest line of reasoning for these people. Something crazy has happened, and they're trying to figure out, how did this happen? They're looking for an answer that explains what happened. And that is an important thing, because when we get into the Pharisees, they're not looking for an answer that explains what happened. They're looking for an answer that they've already determined they want to get. So these people, though some are whether intentionally or not, trying to kind of take the easy way out, saying, no, it just looks like the guy. This crazy thing didn't really happen. In general, the people are following a line of reasoning that's to answer their question that says, this is a fact. We've established now that the man was blind and can see. That can't happen. How did it happen? This was not the cause. This other thing must have been the cause. So they're looking for Jesus, and he says, I don't know where he is. And none of them know where he is, so something miraculous has happened. We'll go to the spiritual leaders, and we'll see what they have to say about it. So the second part, the Pharisees' investigation, verse 13 through 34, so I'll read it. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. And you read that, it's like, oh great, here we go again with the Pharisees. So the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, he put mud on his eyes, on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was division among them. So they said again to the blind man, what do you say about him, since he opened your eyes? He said, he is a prophet. The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see? His parents answered, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind. But how he now sees we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age, he will speak for himself. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be the Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, he is of age, ask him. So for the second time they called the man who had been blind and said to him, give glory to God, we know that this man is a sinner. He answered, whether he is a sinner I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. They said to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered them, I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? And they reviled him, saying, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. The man answered, why, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the beginning of the world has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered him, you were born in utter sin, and you would teach us, and they cast him out. So we'll look at these three questionings independently of each other. The first one, the Pharisees, so they bring the man to the Pharisees, and the Pharisees question the man himself, the man who was born blind. I think it's interesting that, they, as usual, the first thing they get in a huff about is that Jesus did something on the Sabbath. Here they are in a detailed investigation on the Sabbath. I mean, the Pharisees aren't known for consistency, but I guess that explains all of it. They don't care about consistency. So the first kind of question is Jesus the source of power? They have their assumption, and they're starting kind of in the same place the disciples did. They have an assumption about what is true, and that is that what keeping the Sabbath really means. They have their traditions, their rules about it. For whatever reason, they've determined that God himself cannot come and do a miracle on the Sabbath. So because of that, that's our assumption, which we know to be true, and so therefore Jesus cannot be from God. I think it's interesting that from God seems to be in question in this initial questioning, but the fact that a mighty work was done doesn't seem to be in question. They bring that into question later on. We'll talk about that and all the changing of what their argumentation is. But at first, yeah, sure, I believe you. Something crazy was done. God didn't do it. Okay, well, so then you're back in the Beelzebub did it, which this is at least a second time that they are more willing to attribute a great work being done to Satan than they are to attribute it being done to God. Solely, basically, on the assumption that it was done on the Sabbath, so it can't be from God. And all of this, of course, is to discredit Jesus. If it was one of their sons doing a work on the Sabbath day, they'd have been fine with it, it seems. So division arises because some say, well, it can't be from God because it was done on the Sabbath, and we know that to be true. And others say, now look here, this doesn't happen. This cannot be done unless someone is from God. So how do you explain that? So division arises because some of them are unwilling to reconsider their ideas. Not that they verifiably know to be true, but the assumption that they've made, they won't reconsider it. Note that division doesn't arise because everybody in a group is completely honest and open and trying to find the truth. If everybody was like that all the time, there would never be any division. And I suppose you could say there might be for a tiny little bit, and it would immediately be cleared up. because what you said such and such about whatever you should. No, I didn't say that. Oh, okay. Problem solved. There's never any really division to be had. And when they ask the man himself, they're sitting over here and they're having their little huddle trying to figure out what's going on or really how they can explain it away, fighting with each other about how can this impossible thing be done by someone who we don't want to be from God. And so they go back to the man and, what do you say about him? Tell the spiritual leaders what the truth is. And his answer is, well, he's a prophet. This man at least knows something about the history of Israel, and the people who do these things are prophets. They speak for God, God gives them power, and they can do miracles when God wants them to. Well, that's not really good enough for the Pharisees, because they're kind of left in a position of something crazy has been done, and it appears to have been from God, implying that Jesus is from God, and we don't want Jesus to be from God because that threatens our position and our entire worldview. So we will move on to something else. They need to find a new way to explain away, because they cannot end up at the conclusion that Jesus is from God. They refuse to end up there. So, he was never blind. So now they bring the actual work itself into question. I think it's interesting that they seem to have had this in their pocket from the first one, because in 18 the Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man. So that's what initiates them. Okay, yeah, let's talk to the parents, because they don't seem to believe, and they weren't arguing against it before, but they haven't really believed the whole time. So their approach is diligent inquiry to see if they can figure out a different way to get the answer that they want to get. I think it's interesting when, I don't remember the first place Paul is, but he leaves there because they won't listen, and he goes somewhere else, and the Bereans are more noble, diligently inquiring to whatever. So you can work hard trying to figure something out. The Bereans did it the right way, trying to figure out if these things were so. Try to figure out, is this the truth? The Pharisees are willing to work every bit as hard to figure out how what is not so is actually so. That's why we know the Pharisees to be the way we know the Pharisees to be, because they do this over and over and over again. They're not looking for the truth, but rather to discredit Jesus. The blind man, though he doesn't know where Jesus is, and we'll see at the end, he doesn't know what Jesus looks like, but he knows his name. So the first time they ask him, he says the man Jesus, or when the people ask him, he says the man Jesus, up in verse 11. The man Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me. I also think it's interesting, unlike some people who were healed by Jesus, he doesn't seem to be calling out, Lord, Lord, help me. They're walking by, the disciples ask a question, and Jesus is like, yeah, your problem's solved, without apparently him even asking for it, though he certainly is no worse off. But he knows Jesus' name. The Pharisees also know Jesus' name. And so that's kind of directing their route of inquiry sort of in a big wide loop, instead of going directly to Jesus. If suddenly a man is healed and the people can't find who did it, and they take it to this guy, and the guy says, Bob down the street did it, what would they do? Well, they know where Bob down the street is. They would go to Bob down the street and say, look, he says you did this. How did you go about doing this? But he said it's Jesus, and they already know who Jesus is. That's not a route they're willing to take. So we'll ask the man, because we don't know where Jesus is at the moment. Then we'll go ask his parents, and they end up talking to him again. And then almost immediately thereafter, they are somewhere near when Jesus is talking to the man. Jesus is findable, but they're not willing to take that route. So they're asking his parents, and from people with basically all the facts of the matter, all we really have is fear. So they have sort of an easy out, and that is to say, he's grown up, he can answer his own questions, don't ask us. And it says, So we know that this is our son and that he was born blind. So that's the Pharisees' easy out that they thought they might have. That's that gone away. And then, but they don't want to be cast out of the synagogue because the Jews have already agreed. And everybody knows that the Jews have already agreed that if you claim this person is God, you'll be cast out. Interesting and sad, I think. Their son has just been cured of blindness that he had from birth, and they would rather stay in the synagogue with the in crowd and just sort of ignore the fact that there's somebody out there who cured their son of blindness from birth. They'd rather ignore that than be knocked out of the religious circle that they're in. Equally sad, my soul has been taken basically out of Satan's control, where I put it, and I now have the opportunity to, obey God, live righteously, and be in heaven with him eternally. And how often are there things that, well, no, I'd rather not get out of my comfort zone with that goal in mind. Far be it from us, it should be to cast aspersion on people like this, and we do exactly the same thing. Not that we shouldn't learn from it, we should look at it, and people like Ananias and Sapphira and others, and say, that's really pathetic behavior, I better never do that, because we can see it gets us nowhere. So, in a situation like that, is it sad that people pick the losing team because it's more comfortable for them? God is going to win. As absolute fact, God is going to win at the end. So the question is just, which team do we pick? Do we pick the winning team and all that that entails? Do we pick the losing team and all that that brings with it? People pick the losing team because they like what goes along with it better, and they choose to block out of their minds the real loss at the end of it. If we know people like that, that's definitely very sad, and we should try to teach them. But is that a reason for us to then join the losing team exclusively for the company that we would then have on earth? And even if you did do that, why would you want that company? These are people who don't care about truth. They don't care about, honestly following inquiry to get where they want to go. It's just, well, I don't like that end result, so I'm going to block that out of my mind and look at what I get, or even what I think I will get right here, right now. Why would you sacrifice your own well-being so that you can hang out with an evil person? And yet we do that too. Well, so they've established that there was in fact a miracle done. That was the man. He was blind from birth, and now he can see. So the Pharisees have to move on from there, rather than then, starting to change their presuppositions and inquiring from Jesus, or starting to be honest. They go back and ask the man again. So for a second time they called the man who had been blind and said to him, "Give glory to God, we know that this man is a sinner." So they begin by claiming firm knowledge. Give glory to God. Look, we're religious people. We're all churchy people here. We know that this man is a sinner. So that's all they've done, is they've said we know, and then they've inserted what they want to be true. So we have a position, and we are going to impose on you, the formerly blind man, what our position is, and that is what you should base reality on, even though it makes no sense whatsoever. Somehow you've been cured from blindness by a man who is a sinner because of what we say makes him a sinner. The man's response, whether he's a sinner or not, I do not know. Inflection and voice and all that kind of stuff you can't really get out of text, and certainly I can't put it in the man's mouth. But given what they say and then what he says and what they say a little bit later and how he responds to that, I get a little bit of, he's a sinner, huh? You guys are making a really actually complicated and, Gary says, bad argument about what's going on here, and you're trying to tell me, the person that it happened to, what's actually going on with this terrible argument. I don't know about that, him being a sinner thing, because I can see now, well, they don't like this. whether he said it with a little bit of sarcasm in his voice or not, I don't know. What he says, though, they don't like. So they're kind of, tell us again. We don't have to take this from you. Tell us one more time. In their minds, there's got to be a way out of this, because we can't end up at this conclusion that is Jesus is from God, because they just refuse to get there. They refuse to accept that they live in a world where they are wrong, and Jesus is in fact from God. So tell us again. What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And he tells them again, do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? I told you already, and you would not listen. So he knows this is just silly, this game they're playing. So then they go into a kind of weird statement where they say, oh, we know this, but then we don't know this. I don't know if it's to try to give legitimacy to that they're even asking questions at all, because the answer is so obvious. A miracle has been done, and even some of them themselves recognize power like that comes from God. The man is from God. That's so clear, and yet they refuse it. So we know what it is that we want to be true. And in fact, in this case, we know that God has spoken to Moses. Did God speak to Moses? God did speak to Moses. But we do not know where this man comes from. So then, I think a little bit of sarcasm from him again. Why? Especially because of that. That seems to be a little bit of a dig. Why? This is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. A guy opened the eyes of a man born blind, and you don't know where he's from. Why? This is an amazing thing. How can you not know? Let me explain it to you in detail, religious leaders of the Jews. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Now the man is saying, we know, because he really does know. This is truth. This is verifiable. If anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. So in 3 sentences, he explains all that the argument ever should have been. This kind of power comes from God. He exercised this kind of power. Even if, you didn't get to he is God, which you should be getting to because chapter 8, but certainly from God. The man's conclusion of he's a prophet, that's an accurate conclusion. But, of course, they don't like this at all. So they eventually decide, well, we sort of said we don't have to take it from you, and now we're not going to take any more from you. We'll just kick you out of the synagogue because we don't like what you're saying. So removing the opposition is their final. We don't have to listen to it anymore because we have physical authority over the space of the synagogue, and you are not going to be in it anymore because we don't like what you're saying. They've already baselessly accused Jesus of sin. He did something on the Sabbath, therefore he's in sin based on our assumption. So what's preventing them from just saying, this man and your parents, you're sinful too? Nothing prevents them, so they just go ahead and do it. They say, you were born in utter sin, and you would teach us. Well, they've already been saying, we don't know, and he tries to tell them, and yet they refuse to listen. Now we're going to go through the argument thing again, a recap of the Pharisees' Inquisition. And I should have had the true, false, and presumed true sort of up and out of the way, or shuffled a little bit differently, but after I did all the slides, I would have had to change all of them. So just remember, top left is true, top right is false, bottom left is presumed true, and that's just the space for sort of arguments to go. While we're going through this, note the amount of shuffling that's going on. And I realize that you could illustrate a lot of things in ways that would make them, to give an idea that you want to give, even if that idea isn't necessarily true. But we talk about mental gymnastics. That's a phrase we use because we understand that, look, if you're having to twist around and bend and curve and change the meanings of words and all these different kinds of things, you're not in an honest inquiry. You're trying to get somewhere. And that somewhere isn't a dubious place in your mind of, there will be truth at the end of this. It's, I've already decided what the answer is, and I'm going to do whatever I need to the arguments or the facts in the case. So just notice the amount of wiggling. I don't think I've exaggerated the hula hoops that the Pharisees jumped through. So, it's evident that a powerful sign has been performed. From there, the Pharisees in their inquisition, in their minds, have to get to Jesus is not the Christ. And I'm using, in there I have Jesus is not the Christ. Really, in this text, it's more Jesus is from God, not from God. But it's very apparent to them, like I said a second ago, in John 8, right at the end, when they're talking about Abraham and the prophets, in verse, where is it? 58, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. That is a claim to be God to the Pharisees. So there's, Jesus is not the Christ, Jesus is not from God. They know what they're trying to get at here. So, in true, a powerful sign was done, presumes true. Healing on the Sabbath is a sin. Verse 16, they say this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. So, again, we know that's not actually true, but they are assuming it to be so. But also true, verse 16, others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such sign? Powerful signs come from God. That's a fact. And so because of that, division. Who'd have thought? Because if a sign was done, and signs are from God, then healing on the Sabbath, which is the argument against Jesus that claims he's a sinner, cannot be true. And they have to support this as being true. Otherwise, they cannot get to that. That's the only thing they have against it. And of course, it's not even against him. So because of that, in the second one, well, something that was formerly true, now all of a sudden we have to make not true. If in your inquisition you take things that you know to be true and then you decide that they're false, you're lying to yourself. Lying is a bad thing, and you will get to bad places because of it. So the second attempt at reaching their result is there was no powerful sign done, which means their presumption is that the man was not born blind. In order for there to have been no sign, the man must not have been born blind, because you can't heal somebody from blindness who isn't blind. But then they go and start asking questions about that, hoping to get the answer they want, and of course they do not. Verse 20, we know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. So, our second attempt, proven wrong. So they do this, basically. They have to switch a powerful sign back over to true, because the parents irrefutably say, effectively, a powerful sign was done. We still know powerful signs come from God, because they can't really get around that. And the man was not born blind is known false, so the man was born blind. So they basically just end up shouting, healing on the Sabbath is a sin, doing everything they can to get Jesus is not the Christ into true. You know, we have to get this result. We tried it once, it didn't work. We tried something else, that didn't work. We were just out of ways to reach our conclusion. And so, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. There's no explanation, just nothing. We know that this man is a sinner. Leave it at that. Congratulations, you can see now. Don't ask questions. These are the facts. It can't be avoided that he was born blind, a powerful sign was performed, and that powerful signs come from God. So they just demand that their presumption is true and ignore everything else. In contrast to that amount of shuffling, especially the moving things between true and false in order to try to reach a specific conclusion, to illustrate how much simpler it could be if you're actually looking for truth without a predetermined end in mind. A powerful sign was done. Now, this is kind of the situation the people at the beginning are in. Anybody walks in here and says, I was blind from birth, and someone just walked up to me and healed me yesterday. Okay, you can see, so we'll kind of take your word for it, but let's verify. God says to look into things and determine what's true. So we find out, we go talk to the parents. Hey, the man was born blind. That's no longer presumed true. It is true. We know for a fact that a powerful sign was done. For absolute sure. We already know that powerful signs come from God. Because duh. That's the way things work. This can't be done through natural means, and so God had to have done this. So that's kind of a weird way to do it. Jesus is not the Christ. False. This man did this thing. Jesus is from God, and he says he's the Christ. If someone is from God and then says they're from God and then does something that they shouldn't do, God's going to bring an end to that. So the fact that this man can continually carry out these things, and he says he's the Christ, he is the Christ. That's as simple as it gets. And if you follow an honest train of thought, then what is that? Well, would you ever even come up with that if you were just honestly asking questions? Something has happened, whatever it is, and you okay, well, what about this? And you follow the steps actually in the order they occur to verify that something, has happened. You're never going to even get to questions like, who sinned, this man or his parents, or healing on the Sabbath is a sin, because that's not a part of the reason that you need to get to your conclusion. So the third part, Jesus reconnects with the man. In 35 through 41, Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you." He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. Jesus said, "For judgment I came into the world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." This here at the end, 39 and 41 is where he really outright states the purpose of this entire occasion. Those who see may become blind. Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, "Are we also blind?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains." So Jesus finds this guy. Like I said, the man doesn't know what Jesus looks like. He was blind when Jesus put the mud on his eyes, says, "Go wash." He comes back to where he was before, and Jesus isn't there. So he doesn't know what he looks like. Some guy comes up to him and says, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He's like, "Yes, I believe. Tell me who he is." So it's me, and so the man follows through on, he says, "Tell me who this guy is so that I may believe in him, and I can, give him the honor and the worship that is due to him." Compare this man's response to the people of Israel who told Jeremiah, "Tell us what God says about going to Egypt or whatever, and we will do whatever you say." And the words come out of his mouth, and they say, "You're telling a lie." They said beforehand, "We will do whatever you say." And then as soon as he says it, they say, "You're telling a lie. We're not going to do that." This man, on the other hand, an honest man, "Do you believe? Show me who he is, and I will believe in him. It's me." He worships him. No mental gymnastics there. There's just direct faith in what he knows to have occurred. Pride is the barrier that keeps the Pharisees really from accepting the reality of what's gone on here. Interesting, I think, that Jesus says, he's just healed a man, which, lots of the accounts we have of Jesus healing someone. So-and-so came up and Jesus had compassion. And yes, of course, he's in that act, he's proving who he is. So there's other things underlying it, but, Lazarus dies and Jesus weeps. The centurion man has a lot of faith, and so he heals. There's more of a kind of personal connection with what's going on there. He feels compassion on the situation and heals that person's ill, or raises them from the dead, or whatever it is. In this case, he heals a man blind. Ah, yes, what great compassion. For judgment I came into the world. Okay, that's kind of a new Why are we talking about judgment all of a sudden when, yay, sunshine and rainbows, the man's been healed from blindness? The judgment is to divide between those who can't see and those who do see. In this case, those who accept truth and those who absolutely, hard-nosed, refuse to accept it. And we saw this division being created without Jesus actively being there in the first questioning the Pharisees had. Some of them say, oh, he can't be from God because he's done this on the Sabbath. And some people are honest enough to say, now look here, a miracle was done, that power comes from God. And division arose. That is basically the division that Jesus came to bring. Some people are going to look at the situation and say, this is undeniable, God did this. And other people are going to say, no, we refuse to see it. There is no God, or if there is, it isn't him, kind of is what they're saying. It's not him. So division arises. That's a line God can look at and say, the people on this side are thinking honestly with themselves, and the people over here just aren't even interested. And that's a line that we can see too. The man could look at these people arguing and say, well, these people are ridiculous. They're just, I was blind and I'm not anymore. And they're saying this man is from God. So is the blindness Jesus is talking about here actual physical blindness, like he's just healed, or a lack of presupposition in the way we go about answering questions? He'll give sight to those who admit that they can't see, but the people who insist that they see and are in fact seeing something that isn't true, those people in effect he's struck with blindness, because the truth is out there, he's made it clear, and they just have determined in their minds that that is not the case, and we will not accept it. The Pharisees, always putting their foot in their mouths. Some of the Pharisees near, and again, like I said before, the Pharisees are nearby at this point. If they want to ask Jesus, an honest inquirer like Nicodemus, he's available to come and ask questions. So they say, are we also blind? What's he talking about? You're saying I'm blind? Thinking the answer is no. This is a rhetorical question, and this will be a real dig at him. And the answer is yes, you are blind. Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no guilt, but now that you say we see, your guilt remains. And that's why I titled the lesson Innocence and Blindness, because the man was physically blind, but he was willing to accept, and the other people around are willing to accept that we don't know what exactly happened. And the line of thought that they follow to get to a conclusion says, we don't know, and so we're going to ask questions, because if someone was cured of blindness, you would want to know what had happened. You're like, oh, well, that's neat, back to making my pottery or whatever. You're going to inquire. But because the Pharisees insist on their own righteousness, they cannot see what their shortcomings are. They can't see the actual truth, and so your guilt remains. They're not innocent in any way. They put forth their idea and they stick with it regardless of what facts are presented to them. So in conclusion, the answers that we get to the questions we ask are important, obviously. If you in your study you come up with questions, and just questions in life, how should I go about training my child in this way, or should I take this job, kind of thing. The answers that we get to those are important, and they will obviously have influence on our lives, but those answers can be handed to you by somebody else. If the disciples, rather than asking Jesus, had asked the Pharisees, who sinned, this man or his parents? The Pharisees could have said, oh, his parents sinned. Okay. And that's the end of that. So that can have an influence on them, but they didn't get there themselves. The way we get to answers is really a defining feature of where we're going to end up in our lives, because we will still have gotten to an answer of some kind at the end of it, but what determines our answer and what determines the process we went through is what our motivation was. And if the motivation is, I don't want to believe in God, so I am going to do everything I can, I'm going to say that nothing exploded into everything, and so therefore there is no God. God knows what your heart is. God knows you're thinking that. God knows why you're thinking that. If you think, that an amoeba crawled out of the sea and turned into a reptile because you're 6 years old and the people at school are telling you that, there's a level of honesty in that, although your parents should be telling you otherwise, because that's ridiculous. If you believe that because you're a 60-year-old professor of biology and you think something as complex as a human eyeball put together with the rest of humanity and every other everything, God knows that you're thinking that because you don't want to accept God. And that's a division that God makes. Because for judgment he came into the world so that he could say these people will approach the world honestly. And when you approach the world honestly, what is the conclusion you come to? There is a God, and I need to obey him. God is patient and he's merciful with people who are imperfect in practice. Everybody is imperfect in practice, except for Jesus. But God knows the heart. So God doesn't need to keep score and tally. Someone who's sinned their entire life, who accepts the gospel at the very end of their life, there's not some tally that, oh, well, he didn't do enough good deeds. God knows where their heart was at, and can provide his salvation for them because of that. That is the conclusion of the lesson this morning.